recording this one a little bit late into the evening, so hopefully I can stay awake. Alright, so how do we go about integrating some of the species we've recently updated to 5e into our world building? We've completely filled our mountain stronghold and the tunnels underneath it with a large and diverse population. All 18 cities are full. So are all the military postings in the mountain itself. Plus there's the worst jobs list that we recently did, and we could work that into our society, at least for the cities above ground. Let's start there. The salt mining is already covered with the Sal Warren and the kobolds who live there. And pure boys would be limited to where there are actually dogs. This means the monks of Hineg Abbey, following the path of Quo Dei. They would have a monopoly on the pure, and in that, a monopoly on tanning leather as a industrial process. Perhaps they would even buy coyote droppings from the people in Sus Wood if the demand is high enough for their products. In every society, however, there are always outcasts. People who just don't fit in or can't match the standard mold of those around them. In our modern world, these might end up homeless or unemployed or otherwise unfortunate. In our fantasy world, they could be mobile, but not necessarily unemployed or homeless. They could live outside of the cities and towns in wagon camps, working as gong farmers, chamber lie folk, and rag and bone collectors, who travel from place to place, removing all the waste from homes and businesses just to sell it back to the farmers, launderers, and alchemists once it's ready, once it's ripe. Rag and bone, by the way, used to be folks who collected broken things, used clothing, and repaired or repurposed them, both for their own personal use and for reselling at much lower prices than anyone could buy something new for. Just making things serviceable again. Kind of like our modern dumpster divers, either selling things on the sidewalk, or if they can afford a table, selling at the local flea markets. So now we have the least trusted. We have the lowest rung of the goblin-dominated above-ground portion of Texta, our small folk nation. Living out of their wagons, never in the same place for very long. There would likely be several bands of them roving between cities to keep the collections on a steady schedule. Never the best dressed, never the most skilled, or the most pleasant to speak to or be in the presence of, considering the fare of their business. But they always have a few coins in their pocket. They're usually willing to deliver messages, carry letters or packages from one town to the next for a price. But do you trust them? They would have to adhere to the same laws as everyone else, even sending their children for national service as soon as they reach adulthood. They don't own land because they don't need land. They don't build houses because they don't need houses. They neither belong to nor hold loyalty to any city or any city Gwen. They're only answerable to the Great Gwen, or to her soldiers, of course. They'd have to have a few dumping grounds, a few storage buildings, some few places a good distance away from any settlement or any usable ground where their products could sit to mature. Anyone present at those would likely only be there for short periods of time. Until it's their turn to ride off on the wagons collecting again, or to sell their products back to the very same people who paid them to take it away. Being among these folk might be the best place to hide from any problems a player character might have in legal matters. But you have to remember, you can't draw your problems toward them. I think inside the mountain is pretty much done at this point, so let's go outside. Between the mountain and the wall, there's what amounts to 3 days' hard march if the terrain were maintained and cleared. But it's been allowed to grow freely for 600 years, so it's completely wild by now. Swamps and forests, hills and plains, lakes and rivers. Unlike the constant atmosphere inside the mountain, out here there are all 4 seasons to deal with. Plants and animals, various potential dangers, and of course other people. I'm not going to put the Kaitine in Texta, but we could find a place for the Ravenkin, the Gripply, and even the Tazloi out in the wilds. Before we decide where to put these 3 new societies in the landscape, we have to talk a little bit about scale. So, when I say 3 days hard march, it doesn't sound that big. So here's the math. On a forced march, a Roman legion could move roughly 30 miles a day, including the time it takes them to set up and tear down a fortified camp. So between the base of the mountain and the wall would be about 90 miles. We can't call this the radius. We can't call this a radius because we have to determine the size of the mountain itself and add that in. The top, the icy plateau ring at the top of the mountain, is 28 miles across, at least according to the maps I've drawn. The base of the mountain is 4 times that, so 112 miles across. The mountain, 112 miles in diameter. It's a big mountain after all. That gives us a diameter for the whole of the cursed land at 292 miles. So the area of our little nation would be between 267 and 268,000 square miles. That's plenty of room to fit everybody. Hell, they might even be far enough apart they might not know each other exist. And it's room enough for every possible terrain to exist in some form or another. We can have swamps, lakes, and rivers where the Gripply could live happily. We can have deep, dark forests with really high tree canopies for the Tazloi to live in. And overhead, the Ravenkin could tend their flocks of crows and travel vast distances and keep an eye on everything and everyone. Ravenkin wouldn't have a very large population in comparison to the area the vast territory they have access to. Their flocks of crows, however, would be innumerable. We'll say 100 to 1, so If there are 1,000 Ravenkin patrolling their territory and trading information back and forth, they would have 100,000 crows doing their bidding. We'll leave out ravens as, from what I've seen, they don't tend to interact with, get along with crows very well, very on a friendly basis. They coexist peaceably. I mean, they don't attack each other, but they don't interact, and they seem to give each other a little bit of a wide berth. Well, that's what happens when two animals try to share one ecological niche. So these very intelligent scavenger birds, capable of speaking, using tools, and using magic, can own the skies above Texta, outside of the mountain, and might even be keeping tabs on what goes on inside the mountain, at least from whatever is visible from above. It's entirely possible, and even likely, that they've been there and known about the Hermit Kingdom from the beginning. Maybe they even know what the lands in the mountain were like before a goblin named it Texta. But they're as secretive out in the sky as the people inside of the mountain are. It might take a very rare circumstance for the Ravenkin to allow anyone else to know what and who they really are. Like saving one's life for no benefit to yourself, or removing a problem that's been plaguing them for generations. Do you think they'd want to join and become citizens of Texta if that was offered to them? If they were told the laws, do you think they'd agree with them? How do you think a Ravenkin soldier would turn out after or even during national service? Let me know if you have any ideas. Gripply, there being 4 seasons out here, might have an option somewhere within themselves to hibernate for the winter. I wouldn't want it to be a necessity. Considering they're an option as a playable race. But as an option, it makes sense being able to sleep through the times when a large part of their food supply isn't available. This is where their intelligence and ingenuity might be very handy. Being able to prepare and store food long term gives them the chance to stay awake through the winter. Considering how long it takes a Gripply to mature, 100 years before they reach their adult form, and the parental investment required, that would be very useful for them as a society, staying up for the winter. Maybe somewhere in the south, near the wall, there could be large tracts of temperate wetlands, swamps, bogs, marshes. Like most people, they, places in the south that never completely freeze over. They stay right around zero, but never far enough below it to completely freeze over the water. Like most people in Texta, they likely arrived as refugees. They were forced north. When some of their swamps were drained and turned into farmland somewhere else a long time ago. When they found huge bogs, marshes, and swamps, and flowing rivers and still lakes, just a little ways inside that ancient wall, they decided to settle and stay. There was no need for them to go further towards the mountain. They had everything they needed right there. They probably never even thought there might be other people nearby. There could be dozens or 100 small enclaves, like family farms, small clans, small villages, living throughout the wetlands. raising their young, hunting, fishing, and foraging peaceably. How do you think they'd react if they were approached by a party of player characters wearing soldiers' uniforms from inside the mountain? Do you think they'd want to join a larger society as part of a nation? What kind of trade do you think they'd be interested in? What could they offer as commodities? Their winter rations, made of dried bugs and dried fruit. Maybe that'd suit a goblin palate. Maybe goblins would think of it like candy. Maybe there's apothecary, medicinal plants in the swamp, or means of storing things long term without decay, like anoxic environments under the water in still ponds or in the mud. Maybe they could store things for very long times. What if they have an interest in metal tools or warm clothing for the winter parts of the for the coldest parts of the year? There's a lot of possibilities there. Tasloi would be most comfortable among the trees, so old wild growth forests. However and whenever they arrive might be lost to them, outside of a few whispered myths and legends. Because remember, oral traditions can last a long time, but eventually they start to change little by little in the retelling. The way they live, the way they would build their homes high in the tree canopies, it's entirely possible that there are Tasloi who live their entire lives never setting foot on the ground. Amid hunting and scavenging, they might have found ruins even older than the walls that surround the nation. Would they want to become a part of a nation? Would they, once they know it existed, how well would their traditions and taboos mesh with written laws? How would the goblins and kobolds from inside the mountain react or interact with the Tasloi? If some of them ever decide to go inside the mountain, how well would they get along with the people in Suswood or in the rest of the mountain? What kinds of trade do you think they'd be interested in? Metal tools, medicines? What could the people inside the mountain offer that the Tasloi would really want? And vice versa, what do the Tasloi have that the rest of Texta would want? Again, it's a lot, there's so many possibilities. With this large an area, even just adding these 3 new people groups, but there could be so much more in the lands. What sort of monsters could be living out in the wilds? Caves, foothills, plains? What might live in the rivers or the lakes? What might be burrowing underground, under the forests? Even just animals. Remember, there's nothing inside the mountain that's too big for small folk to handle. There aren't cattle in there, there's goats. So what if on the outside they run into a pack of wolves, or a cougar, or a moose for that matter? What happens then? Maybe I should put everything together and try to publish a campaign setting. Do you think that'd be a good idea? Seriously, if you do, I need an editor and an illustrator. So find those for me, and I might consider it. But is there anything I've missed? Are there ideas, mistakes, anything obvious to you that I just didn't think of? Anyway, like, share, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you think, and I'll talk to you next time.